The room was quiet, only the sound of the air conditioning filling the space. The man sat in front of the young people, who looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Each of them believed they knew exactly who he was, a former employee who had not kept up with the times. But there was something in his gaze, a depth that seemed to hide much more than the others could see. And it was at that moment that, out of the blue, he said something that made the air in the room stop. "You think you know who I am, don't you? But tell me, do you really know what it means to carry a past that no one sees? And if it were you, what would you do when your greatest achievements were ignored by those who only know the age of the internet and social networks?" The young people looked at each other, not knowing how to react. To them, he was nothing more than someone who had already been surpassed, someone who had been left behind. But were they right? Did they really understand the weight of what he carried, or were they just stuck on the surface? When he began to reveal the secret, the entire room knew that nothing there would ever be the same again. The young people began to look at each other, trying to understand what was happening. The room, which had been silent before, became increasingly dense. The man, who had introduced himself as someone old-fashioned, was now about to reveal something that would leave everyone there in shock. His eyes, which had previously seemed empty and tired, shone with an intensity that no one expected. He knew that this was a decisive moment, that his truth could no longer be kept hidden. "I have a story to tell," he began, his voice firm but full of repressed emotion. "And you may not even be able to believe what I'm going to say. It's not easy to talk about what I've experienced, but perhaps it's necessary." The silence in the room became palpable. The young people, now more curious than before, leaned forward, attentive to every word that came out of the man's mouth. They were there, looking for a job interview, but what he had to tell them seemed like something much bigger, something that would change the course of that conversation. "I was born in a time when people knew each other by what they did, by what they lived, not by what they posted or liked. I grew up in a place where the daily struggle was not about winning or losing a virtual game, but about standing firm while the world around you seemed to fall apart." He paused, observing the surprised expressions of the young people. He knew he would not convince them easily. They had a vision of the world so different from his, a vision in which a person's worth seemed to be measured by how many followers they had or how up-to-date their technology was. But he was not there to judge anyone. His mission was simply to show that time and life experience had a value that no innovation could erase. "You know what it's like to be forgotten, right?" the man asked, his eyes fixed on each of the young people. "Maybe not in the same way as me, but they know what it's like to feel invisible in a world that moves so fast that no one remembers what happened yesterday. I lived this for a long time, but what no one knew is that behind this facade of outdated, I carried something that could change everything." He sighed again, as if preparing to release something very heavy. His shoulders relaxed a little, as if he was letting the load fall slowly. "I was a pioneer in a revolution. When technology was just beginning to change the world, I was one of the first to see the potential of everything that was to come. I was part of a secret project, a project that, if it had worked, would have changed the history of communication on the planet. But like many good things in life, it was neglected, left behind." The young people were now completely silent. None of them knew what to say. They looked at the man, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he was saying. The youngest, Daniel, was the first to speak, with an expression of distrust mixed with curiosity. "Asterisk, you're saying that you invented something that could have changed the way we communicate today? And why don't we know about it?" he asked, the incredulity evident in his voice. The man shook his head slowly, his eyes softening as the memory returned. "I didn't invent something alone. I was part of a team that had the opportunity to transform the digital world as we know it. But the project was discontinued. The company decided to invest in another direction, completely ignoring the potential of our idea. And so, what could have been the future became just a lost draft, a shelved project. Paul's words, the oldest man in the room, were filled with bewilderment. But how is that possible? How can something so big be left aside? The man smiled, a wistful smile, as if he knew that this was the question that could hit the hardest. The world is not ready to value what comes before its time. Sometimes ideas are too big for the moment, and people cling to what is easiest, to what is already familiar. I spent my whole life being seen as outdated, as someone who no longer has a place in the new world. But the truth is that, even if I have been forgotten, the impact of that project is still there in the things you use every day. Silence took over the room again. No one knew what to say. Each of the young people was absorbing the man's words in a different way. The idea of a lost future, a future that could have been theirs, was something difficult to accept. They were not used to thinking of the past as something that could still influence the present. They were so immersed in the now and the speed of updates and innovations that they had never asked themselves if, in the past, something could have been more significant. But you're not saying that your idea failed, are you? Asked Beatrice, the oldest of the group, trying to find some logic in all of this. Because if it was something so important, it should have been done, right? The man looked at her with a look that seemed to pierce her soul. Sometimes the most valuable things are not recognized at the right time. They are hidden, waiting for someone to have the vision to see what is beyond the surface. I, like you, was part of that process. I, like you, made mistakes, and I was left behind. But now it is different. Now you know what really happened. There was something in the way he spoke, something that made each word sound like a key to understanding what was really behind the curtain of time. Not only was he revealing a secret about his past, but he was also making the young people question the way they saw the world around them. They were beginning to understand that behind every label, there was a story that deserved to be heard. And perhaps, at that moment, the biggest secret of all was precisely this. What passes for outdated may, in fact, be what comes before everyone else. The room was quieter than ever. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and enigmatic. No one seemed to know what to make of the revelation he had made. The young people were deep in thought, trying to piece together the puzzle he had just presented. Some were confused, others skeptical, and few were beginning to understand the depth of what he had said. Beatrice, the oldest, was the first to regain her composure. She crossed her arms, her expression now more serious. So, what you're saying is that somewhere in the past, there was a technology that could have changed the way we communicate today. And you were part of it? She paused, looking directly at the man. But why have we never heard of it? The man studied her for a long moment, as if considering the best way to explain it. You young people grow up in a world of rapid innovation where what's new is adored and what's old is discarded. What doesn't fit the mold of the moment, what's not fashionable or trendy, is ignored. The truth is, it wasn't just a matter of technology. It was a matter of vision, of seeing something before everyone else. And not everyone was ready for that. My team and I were pioneers, but the world wasn't ready. And that's why today, it's not talked about anymore. Daniel, the youngest of the group, seemed to be absorbing the magnitude of the conversation in a way that no one else could. He stood up from his chair with an air of determination. So you're saying that everything we use today, the apps, the internet, social media, could be completely different if things had happened differently? The man nodded slowly. Exactly. The idea we had was revolutionary. But as I said, it wasn't accepted. The company we worked for didn't believe in its potential. They went another way, and the project was shelved. The rest, as they say, is history. But all of this could have been different. The others looked at each other, trying to process what was being said. It was hard to imagine that, at some point, such a powerful idea could have been so easily dismissed. But the man was there, talking about his experience as if it were just another day in his life, although it was clear that, for him, it was nothing like that. Beatrice, now more thoughtful, asked one last question. But why didn't you fight for this idea to be adopted? Why did you leave all of this behind? He gave a small, sad smile and shook his head. I fought, believe me. But there were limitations. It wasn't just about the idea, it was about the timing. Sometimes the best projects fall by the wayside because they simply don't fit the time they come in. And when you're disregarded by those who should be supporting you, you start to question your own worth. So what do? You try to move on, you try to find a new path. He seemed to be reflecting, not just on the project, but on the very journey that had brought him there. He had experienced rejection, failure, and yet here he was, talking about it all with a serenity that now seemed more impressive than the story itself. So you just gave up? Daniel asked, a hint of disbelief in his voice. You didn't do anything else after that? The man looked at the young man, his eyes now deepening. It wasn't quite like that. I didn't give up, but sometimes you have to accept that not everything is under your control. I was thrown out of the Innovation Center and my journey went in another direction. What you call giving up is often just adapting to reality. I kept working, I kept my life, but not in the same way. I realized that the world wasn't ready for what I had to offer at that time. But who can say what would have happened? If we had had another chance, silence invaded the room again. The young people were now looking at the man in a different way. He was no longer the old man who was outdated, someone who seemed to be lost in the past. He had carried a truth with him for all those years, a truth that was hard to digest, but that was now finally being revealed. But aren't you bitter about all this? Beatrice asked, her voice low, almost with a sense of compassion. I mean, doesn't it make you question everything you've done, all the choices you've made? Asterisk, the man leaned forward, his eyes fixed on her. No, Beatrice, I'm not bitter. On the contrary, I'm grateful. Because what I've learned over the years is that time has its own way of giving answers. I was left behind by a generation that didn't understand what we were trying to do. But now I see the impact of our idea, even if in an indirect way. Every step in technology, every small innovation, even the things you use every day, have a piece of that vision that we lost. He paused, and everyone's eyes were now fixed on him, waiting for his next word. And maybe, who knows, if things had been different, today you would be working on something completely different. Something that we couldn't show the world. Daniel, with a deeper look, finally said what everyone was thinking. So, you're saying that your idea didn't die. It just wasn't recognized as it should have been. The man smiled again, this time with a gleam of hope in his eyes. Exactly. Sometimes, what seems like a failure is just the beginning of something that takes longer to mature. History, my friends, is not made of immediate successes and failures. Sometimes, history is written in the silence of what has not been recognized. Now, more than ever, young people were beginning to understand the true message behind all of this. It wasn't about feeling outdated or being carried away by circumstances. It was about resilience, about how ideas can survive the test of time, even when the world is not ready for them. The man had revealed much more than a simple secret from the past. He had shown that, even though the world was always in flux, the seeds of a great project can blossom, even years after they are planted. Asterisk, the man looked at the young people, who now seemed to be reflecting more deeply on his words. There was a mix of confusion and admiration on their faces. Each one was trying to digest what they had just heard, but there was something there that connected them, something that transcended the simple idea of a project lost in the past. What the man was saying seemed to be much more than a story of failures. It was a lesson in perseverance, of how the things that really matter can be ignored, but they do not disappear. So, do you believe that our generation is, in some way, making the same mistake? Beatrice asked, her voice reflecting a concern that was taking hold of everyone. That we are paying too much attention to superficial things and not realizing what can really change the world. He looked at her, and for a moment it seemed like he was looking into a mirror. The words she had just said were the same ones he had thought years ago, when he saw his project being discarded in the name of something more modern. Yes, he answered firmly. I think we are missing out on something very valuable by only looking at what shines now, without realizing that what really matters is often hidden. True value is sometimes not recognized right away. Daniel, who had been quiet until then, turned to the man with a curious expression. Do you really think the world will understand this one day? That this idea you had will be recognized, even if it is late? The man smiled slightly, without revealing any exaggerated confidence. I don't know. Maybe. What I do know is that the idea that something needs to be recognized immediately to have value is an illusion. Time will, somehow, give its own verdict. And when it does, who knows, maybe you will look back and realize that all that potential was there all along, just waiting to be seen. Beatrice reflected on these words with an almost imperceptible smile. She never imagined that a simple job interview would turn into such a profound lesson. She looked at the other young people and noticed that they were beginning to question their own perception of the world. What had seemed like just an old fogey now turned out to be a source of wisdom, someone who had seen something bigger, yet somehow still held firm to his purpose. So what do you think we should do with this? Asked Paul, the oldest man in the group, breaking the silence that followed. We're sitting here in a room listening to a story we've never known. How should we apply all of this to our work and our lives? How does it change what we're doing? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at each of the young men in turn, as if trying to see what they were thinking. When he finally spoke, it was calmly, but with a depth that seemed to touch each of them. I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't do. The choice of how you apply what you've learned today is entirely up to you. What I can say is that sometimes true innovation doesn't come from creating something completely new, but from noticing what's already there and giving it a chance to grow. You have the ability to change the world around you, not because you're faster or smarter, but because if you're able to look beyond the obvious, you'll see what others can't. His words hung in the air, and no one seemed to move, as if they were still trying to process everything. The room, which had previously been filled with palpable nervousness about the job interview, now had a different tension. It was as if the conversation had made everyone more aware of something much bigger than just a job. There was an implicit responsibility in their actions, a power to change the course of things. Beatrice was the first to speak, her voice low but full of understanding. I understand. Sometimes we are so focused on doing things quickly, on achieving immediate success, that we end up forgetting to look at what really matters. And what really matters, often, is what cannot be seen at first glance. What is right in front of us, but which we can only perceive when we stop to look at it in a different way. The others nodded, and the atmosphere in the room began to change. They were beginning to see the value of the man's words, not as a lesson from the past, but as a warning for the present. There was something in his experiences, something that transcended the idea of just an untold story. They were beginning to realize that what he really wanted to teach was about resilience and the ability to see the value in things that are often discarded. And you, What will you do now? Daniel asked with a tone of genuine curiosity. Are you going to try again to do something that could change the world? Or is that already in the past for you? The man took a deep breath before answering. I'm not young anymore. I don't have the fire I used to have, the energy to fight against the tide. But in a way, I've done my part. Now it's your turn. The future is in the hands of people. Like you. What I do now is just to make sure that my story, however small it may have been, isn't lost. I want you to see what I saw, so that you can do what I couldn't do. It was a statement that seemed simple, but it carried immense weight. The room was different. The young people were more aware of their responsibility, not just as professionals, but as people who had the power to look beyond the surface and recognize the value in things that, until then, had gone unnoticed. The man had taught them something much deeper than any resume or professional experience. He had shown them that sometimes the greatest learning comes not from rushing to be first, but from recognizing that what lies behind us, however ancient it may seem, can be the key to transforming what lies ahead of us. The young people were silent, each lost in their own thoughts, trying to digest everything they had learned at that moment. The man, now calmer, watched with an attentive gaze. He knew he had not given easy answers, but he felt that something important was happening. There. It was not just a job interview, but a meeting of different worlds, where the past and present intertwined in unexpected ways. So, what now? Beatrice finally asked, breaking the silence. How do we move forward? How do we apply everything you told us? The man smiled softly. The answer, Beatrice, is not in me. It is in each one of you. I shared my story, not to show that my path was right or wrong, but to make you question what you are doing with your time, with your ideas. The world changes, it will always change, but don't lose focus on what really matters. If you blindly follow what is fashionable, what everyone is saying is right, you may be ignoring something very valuable that is right in front of you. Daniel, still impressed, shook his head slowly. I didn't think that a simple interview would become something so profound. I guess I was so focused on getting the job, on impressing, that I never stopped to think about what I was really looking for. How can we find that? How do we know when we are seeing what really matters? The man stood up slowly, his steps firm on the wooden floor, and approached a window. He looked outside as if searching for an answer that wasn't there. The problem, Daniel, is that answers don't come right away, and they're rarely where you expect them to be. What I can suggest is that instead of chasing after something that everyone tells you you should want, look for something that fulfills you, that makes you feel like you're truly contributing to the world around you. There was a moment of silence. As the young men reflected, the man's words were beginning to take shape in their minds, and a new understanding was dawning. They realized that often what they were looking for in life wasn't as clear as a simple job or an immediate victory. It was something deeper, more intangible, something that could actually make a difference in the long run. I think I get it, Beatrice said, with a small but sincere smile. We spend so much time chasing what's visible, what's in front of our eyes, that we forget to look inside at what really matters, at what can have a lasting impact. Asterisk, the man looked at her and nodded. Exactly. The world will always change, and you will be challenged all the time. But what will make you stand out, what will truly transform your lives and the world around you, is the ability to see what others cannot. To have the courage to follow a path that is not always the easiest or the quickest. And most of all, to understand that what seems like failure today can be the seed of success tomorrow. The conversation had veered into more philosophical territory, deeper than either of the young men had expected. They were there to get a job, but they were leaving that room with something much more valuable. They were leaving with the understanding that, In the end, it wasn't about being the fastest or always ahead of everyone else. It was about being able to see beyond, to seek a greater purpose, to connect with something deeper that made them whole. "I don't think we have any doubts anymore," Paul said, breaking the silence that followed. He seemed genuinely touched by the man's words. "But what now? What are you going to do?" The man was silent for a moment. He knew that the moment he was living was, perhaps, the last chapter of his own story of struggle and overcoming. But the most important thing, he knew, was that he didn't need anything else to feel fulfilled. He had passed on his legacy. The rest now was in the hands of those who listened to him. Now? Now it's time for you to write your own stories. He replied with a look that carried a wisdom that only time could offer. "I've done my part. Now the future is yours." Don't let the fear of failure or the incessant search for approval make you lose what really matters. When the world tells you that you're outdated, remember that it's only because it hasn't yet understood your true value. Each of the young people stood up, one by one, and went to the man. There was no longer any rush, no anxiety for the interview. There was a quiet respect, a shared understanding that this moment had transformed their perspectives. They were leaving, not just with a chance at a job, but with something far more valuable, the ability to see the world through new eyes, to see the invisible and value what others cannot see. As they left the room, the sound of the young men's footsteps slowly faded away. The man stood there, staring out the window, but not with sadness. He knew the cycle had come full circle. His secret, which had been kept for so long, had now been shared. And somehow he knew that by doing so, something would change. Not just in their lives, but perhaps in the way the world would see the true meaning of progress. Sometimes, true innovation comes from understanding the value of the past, not from ignoring it. The door closed softly, and he stood there, a quiet smile on his face. Now that you've heard this incredible story about looking beyond the obvious and finding true value in things, imagine how many other lessons like this can transform the way you see the world. If you enjoyed this moment of reflection and want more stories that make you think, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll never miss a new journey full of learning.